Go.
Good evening. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and everyone at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual author event, An Evening with David Litt. To introduce myself, I'm Eli Horgan, a rising junior at Columbia University, studying politics on fellowship this upcoming year at the University of Oxford Lady Margaret Hall. I grew up reading in the children's section of the Coral Gables store and shelved books there throughout most of high school, and they clearly can't seem to get rid of me. This summer, I'm helping with Representative Javier Fernandez's campaign for Florida Senate, and I'm so excited to welcome you all here tonight. With that established, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce New York Times bestselling author and former Obama speechwriter David Litt in conversation with Fred Guttenberg for David's concise yet comprehensive, impeccably researched, and unexpectedly hilarious new book, Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. To introduce the author, David Litt entered the White House as a speechwriter in 2011 and left in 2016 as a senior presidential speechwriter and special assistant to the president. In addition to writing remarks for President Barack Obama on a wide range of domestic policy issues, David served as the lead joke writer for 4 White House Correspondents' Dinner monologues. Litt has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The LA Times, and GQ, among others. He appears frequently on television to discuss politics. From 2016 until 2018, Litt was the head writer for the Washington, D.C. office of Funny or Die, and he is currently developing a TV show for ABC based on his life in Washington. In conversation with David tonight, we are honored to have Mr. Fred Guttenberg. Fred Guttenberg began his public life after the murder of his beautiful 14-year-old daughter, Jamie, in the Parkland school shooting on February 14th. The day after the murder, Fred decided to attend a public vigil in Parkland. While there, the mayor asked him to speak. His words shook a nation, and he has not stopped since. Fred and his wife, Jennifer, now spend time challenging our elected officials to do more. They began a nonprofit organization dedicated to Jamie's life called Orange Ribbons for Jamie. He has been a regular on TV news programs and a myriad of online and print media. Through the formation of the nonprofit, this is now his full-time mission. Please remember, throughout the duration of tonight's event, you are encouraged to speak up and ask questions. In our virtual format, please find the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen to do so. I'll also take a moment to remind you that you can order Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think by clicking the button on the screen below. Every order supports your locally owned independent bookseller, Books and Books, and helps us to stay in business. So thank you. And now, without further ado, let's welcome author David Litt and moderator Fred Guttenberg. Thank you.
Hey guys, how are you? And David, nice to talk to you. I've actually been looking forward to this conversation for a while. And when I think of democracy today, especially in the current news cycle, which is just really boring. I mean, there's nothing happening. And of course, our democracy, it seems stable under the current occupant of the White House. Not really. I guess my first question for you, in the reality of where we are today, kind of take us back to the beginning. Why did you do this book? What are you hoping to get out of it? And again, in the perspective of where we are today.
Yeah. So Fred, first of all, before I answer that question, let me just start by saying a huge thank you to Eli for introducing us, and also to Mitchell and to Books and Books for hosting us tonight. And I think that one of the things that this pandemic has made us realize even more than we did beforehand was just how valuable great local independent bookstores are and how hard they work. And so on this book tour, I've gotten to partner with a bunch of terrific independent bookstores, and Books and Books is one of the best in the country, as you all know. So it's a real honor to get to do this with them. And Fred, it's an honor to get to talk about my book with you, because at its heart, this is a book about how we keep alive the words that Barack Obama said who got me involved in politics in the first place, that people who love this country can change it. And I don't think there's a more succinct summation of your life and work for so many years now. And so, it's a thrill to be able to talk about a subject I care about with people I admire. And then on top of that, apparently there's lots of people watching us. So how exciting is that too? All right, so let me talk about how I started and why I wrote this book. The thing that I kept running into when I was in the Obama White House, and it's only gotten worse under Trump, is this basic dynamic that the American people want one thing out of their democracy, and we keep getting another. And so that's true on issue after issue: climate change, healthcare, the economy. It's true when it comes to how we should be responding to COVID. I know especially right now in Florida, that's a particularly important issue. It's true when we think about how we want to deal with systemic racism and how we want to reform policing. On all of these issues, Americans are actually, there's not this split between populists and elitists.
Right.
The public feels one way, the experts feel the same way, and yet our government is doing something else. And Fred, I think nowhere is that more true, and I use this example over and over in the book, than when it comes to gun safety and preventing gun violence. And yet we're not getting what we want from our government. So I wanted to write about that fundamental question: why is that? How do we fix it? But I also wanted to write a book for people like me. So I am not the kind of person that finishes, giant books that are full of charts and tables and you leave and you're super depressed. I don't tend to get through them, especially when it's not my job. And so I wanted to write a book that I felt I would read, something that's interesting and engaging, but ultimately gives you everything you need to know in order to be an American who's active in changing your country at a time when that really matters.
So tell us what you learned in researching all of this. We only have it's under 150 days until the election. This is, before every election, you hear people say, this is the most monumental election of our lifetime. Well, I think we can all agree. This is the most monumental election of our lifetime. What did you learn? David, I do believe our democracy is at risk. I got into what I do because of gun violence. Watching how things work has gotten me way more engaged in the bigger picture of our democracy and what's required there to get something done. And you just mentioned it. So what did you learn? What do we need to know?
Well, I think the most important thing that I learned as it relates to the 2020 election is this. So it's very easy for politicians to say this is the most important election of our lifetimes. I have written those words about multiple elections for multiple politicians and surrogates and so on. This election, I think, is the most important of our lifetimes. But I think what is unique in particular about this election is that democracy is on the ballot in a way that democracy has not been on the ballot in the past. And I would include, I'm a Democrat, but that's not about which party it is going to win. It's about whether or not we continue to have a system of fair and free elections, whether or not we continue to have a system that, more or less looks like the one that we all learned about from Schoolhouse Rock, where we have an idea and it can become a bill and it can become a law. So we can go through some of the ways, and I'm sure we will, that's true. But the thesis of the book is that within my lifetime, and I'm 33 years old, democracy has changed substantially. I mean, the system of government that I live in right now, that we are living in as we have this conversation, is totally different than the one that I was born into. And in almost every way, our representative government is less representative of the people than it used to be. And it's more representative of just a handful of very, very powerful people and very powerful interests. And that's not an accident. It's by design. Our government has largely been dismantled or changed in order to reflect the interests of a few powerful people over the interests of the vast majority of the United States. And this election might be our last chance to undo that trend.
And boy, we're seeing that right now in response to coronavirus.
Absolutely.
The emphasis is not on public safety. It's on ensuring businesses and those who maybe contribute politically can stay economically viable. And it's a terrible disconnect. And we Americans who will have a chance to vote on this are paying a serious price for that. I mean, we're over 100,000 dead.
Well, let me tell you a story that I think helps illustrate that. But first, I feel like my publisher always tells me I have to Vanna White the book cover as much as possible. So first of all, in case you were wondering, everyone at home, this is the book. It's got a picture of the American flag, so you know which country I'm talking about. And one of the things, as I researched the history of American politics, that I did not realize, and it relates directly, Fred, to what you just asked me about COVID, is the way that corporate power is more organized, more politically organized in America than ever before. And it certainly wasn't at all organized before the 1970s. So to give you an example, I believe it was the early 1950s, we passed the Defense Production Act. You may have remembered people talking about the Defense Production Act because it's the thing that the Trump administration could have used to compel companies to make ventilators. And in the end, just to make sure that we're not in the world of alternative facts, they kind of used it, but mostly dragged their feet, and certainly didn't for a very long time. Now, in 1950, when the Defense Production Act was passed, the amount of money spent lobbying Congress annually was 1/30th, one divided by 30 of the amount of money spent today. And that's just the money we know about. There's all kinds of money that can flow into the policymaking process in secret. The Chamber of Commerce was barely an entity. Most businesses did not have Washington offices the way they do now. So the idea that the Chamber of Commerce and corporate executives could get together and pressure the government not to use the Defense Production Act never came up when they were writing the Defense Production Act, which was roughly when my grandparents were, their generation, because they didn't think about that. And so one of the things I tried to talk about in the book, I set out when I started this book, I said, I want to write a book about structural democracy reform without ever once using the phrase structural democracy reform. Because so often we think of these things as kind of like little quirks of political science or trivia questions, but they're not. They're part of this story about how we, the people, started to lose power and a few interests gained it. And that's one of the reasons why we see decisions being made based on the health of corporations and business interests rather than on public health. It's not an accident.
No, it's not. And it's the same story with the issue most important to my heart, guns. And when the 24 hours after my daughter was killed, I attended this vigil in Parkland. I ended up speaking there. And that night I went home and I said, I want to break the effing gun lobby. And that week I said, all I said was, go after the money. I wasn't interested at the time in politics or politicians because the money was holding them hostage. And we've been successful. People can't, you can't overestimate the importance of a company like Dick's Sporting Goods changing their business model because it showed you can go against that money and be okay. You can't overestimate the fact that because we all marched on Tallahassee, gun safety in Florida, of all places, a conservative state like Florida, got passed. And we showed that we could go up against this interest. And in fact, that carried through to the 2018 election when we flipped the House. Mm-hmm. And I do expect that people are going to do the same thing again in this next election. Because ultimately, and I don't know how you feel about this, I've started to lose a little bit of hope over the past year in some of our levers of democracy because we've seen them very successfully challenged by somebody who doesn't believe in our democracy. And the lever we have left is voting, and we have to be successful at it. But we've seen how our democracy can be pushed to the brink by somebody who doesn't believe in its fundamental pillars. And so I want to hear you talk a little bit more just about that, how we got to this place and how important it is that Americans show up in massive numbers. It has to be major.
Yeah, well, so Fred, first let me sort of talk about the part that's worrisome and not terribly hopeful, and then I'll pivot to why we don't have to despair quite yet, and why I actually remain an optimist about both our democracy and about our ability to make our voices heard in elections. So we are in, or at least we're virtually speaking, we are in Florida. And Florida, as those of you watching may imagine, in any book about how democracy has gone wrong, and particularly how elections have gone wrong, Florida features quite heavily. Florida is kind of the Forrest Gump of election. And if you look at Florida, we could spend literally hours, probably years, talking about all of the different ways Florida elections have gone awry, both on purpose and by accident. But one of the ones I'm going to point to that I'm sure many of you watching are familiar with, the disenfranchisement law that kept 1.5 million Floridians from voting. So this was a law, for those of you who aren't familiar, that said if you have ever committed a felony, then you cannot vote. Even after you've served your time, you cannot vote in Florida for life. And this law was not an accident. The effect was not an accident. It comes out of the 1860s. Florida was no longer allowed to disenfranchise black voters by law because the Civil War had ended. But they came up with this creative new way of disenfranchising black voters. So they expanded the definition of a felony to cover, including things like wandering or strolling about, by the way, was a felony in Florida in the 1800s. And then they added this other law that says if you've ever committed a felony, you can't vote. And of course, then as now, these laws were not enforced the same for everybody. So the people who were arrested and charged with felonies for wandering or strolling about were almost entirely black. And so black voters were disenfranchised, even though they had been liberated from slavery, and technically you were not supposed to be allowed to disenfranchise former slaves. Now, to bring us back to the present, in Florida in 2016, 1.5 million voters couldn't vote, and disproportionately, those voters were non-white. And Florida, more than any other state, I think, except maybe Texas gives you all a run for your money. Florida demonstrates that in America, we have an election system that allows you to try to win elections rather than by persuading people that you have the best ideas or changing your ideas so that you're giving people what they want. You can give people what they don't want. You can pass laws that target them. But then if you also target their voting rights, they can't complain. And so that I think is, there's a lot of Florida elections, I mean, at least the 2000 election, where that's the story of that election. Now, what makes me hopeful is that despite all of that, the American people tend to feel like we would like our democracy to work. We don't want our politicians pushing voters out of the electorate, even people we don't agree with, which is one of the reasons why in Florida, more than 16% of Floridians voted for a ballot measure to overturn that discriminatory law in 2018, which was a remarkable thing, and it was not a Democratic thing. It was among voters and among campaigners, it was Democrats and Republicans and independents, and now, of course, you have the state legislature and your governor trying to, reinstate it in some sort of.
They continue losing in court, but they continue trying.
But they're not, and it's worth noting how hard they try, right? You talked about, Fred, the issue that matters most to you, of course, is gun violence. The issue that seems to matter most to a lot of politicians is the laws that allow them to keep their power without having to do things that the American people support. That's what they will go to the mattresses to defend. And it says a lot about that, but it also says a lot about how powerful our votes are. Right? That you have politicians who are so scared of you exercising your vote that they will go well out of their way to try to keep people from voting. And that's because they understand that despite everything that they've done and despite all of the flaws in the way our election system is constructed, this is still a country where if people decide they want something in large enough numbers, if there's a moment where people rise up and translate that energy to the ballot box, a lot can happen very quickly. And I think that's still the case. And so that's why I'm hopeful about the power of voting as we go into 2020, even as we have to be careful to protect that power.
So I want to change gears from this heavy, serious stuff for a second. Hold up the book again.
Okay. Here it is.
Mitch McConnell. And I feel he is as disastrous to our democracy as any single individual person can be. But you had an issue, or you made an effort to crash his frat house, and you talk about it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was going on there? What you were thinking, and what came of it?
What was I thinking? That's a fair question. I delved into a lot of tough questions in the book, but what was I thinking is not. I left that one out. So for me, Mitch McConnell, he was not the hero of this book. It will not surprise you to learn, but he's certainly the protagonist of this book. I think I say this in there, that there's no one I have thought more about other than my wife and my cats over the last 3 years than Mitch McConnell. And the reason is because I think Mitch McConnell understood very early on that while the rest of us were very much focused on the players on the field, who are the politicians, who's winning elections, what laws are being passed, Mitch McConnell was focused on the rule book. And he understood that if you rewrite the rules, you can win, not necessarily every time, but you can give your team an unfair advantage time after time after time, and it builds and accumulates. And I think the democracy we're living in today is very much the democracy that it's the house that Mitch built. And so in the same way that if I was writing a book about the Beatles, I might go to Abbey Road and take that famous picture. With Mitch McConnell, I thought I have to go to Louisville and do my Mitch McConnell pilgrimage. And where better to start than the old frat where Mitch McConnell was student body president at the University of Louisville. It was the early days of his political career. And I will say, I don't know if anyone watching this is like a guy in your 30s and you're thinking of crashing a frat party. I do not recommend it. It does not work very well. You look older to them than you realize. They're not fooling anyone. So these are valuable life lessons from this book. But what I did learn when I was at the University of Louisville was that there's this persistent rumor on campus, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I talked to tons of people who all believed it, that Mitch McConnell actually owns the land underneath the frat house. And what I thought was really remarkable about that, and ultimately illustrated an important point, was that there is this sense, even on a college campus, that Team Mitch plays by one set of rules, and the rest of us are on the other team, and there are a lot more of us, but we don't get to win because we play by a very different set of rules. And so, I didn't get inside the fraternity. I'll have to live with that knowledge. But sadly, even though I didn't, I did feel like I learned something important about the way we think about power in this country.
Well, next time you want to go to Kentucky to take on Mitch and do something about Mitch, invite me.
Okay, great.
I'd love to join.
Excellent. One day, hopefully, we'll be able to travel, and
and hopefully he'll be fired by then.
One hopes.
Let's talk about voter fraud, because it happens. But some, including the current occupant of the White House, talk about it a lot, and I suspect they think of it very differently than you and I, or they're using it for different purposes.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the history of American politics is, in part, the history of politicians falsely claiming fraud in order to remove eligible voters from the voter rolls. There have been cases of fraud. In Miami, there was a mayor's election that was overturned in, I think it was 1997, due to fraud. The Republican Congressman Mark Harris, he committed voter fraud in 2018, or his campaign did, and that election was thrown out and they redid the election. However, there's the specific type of voter fraud that Donald Trump really likes to talk about, which is in-person voter fraud, voter impersonation. So that's where, I show up, Fred, at your polling place, and I say, I'm Fred, I would like to vote, please, and I cast a ballot as you. Or maybe you've moved, or I cast a ballot, on behalf of someone who's deceased. That happens in America. It happens about 1 out of every 35 million ballots. So to give you an idea of just how rare, and again, keep in mind, this is the stuff that Trump and so many Republicans, it's not just Donald Trump, because he has weird obsessions. This is an entire party obsessed with this kind of voter fraud. If you took a human chain of voters and it stretched from New York to Seattle and then down to Los Angeles and then all the way over to New Orleans, in this entire human chain, on average, one person would be committing voter fraud. We would not see an election swung by in-person voter fraud until about the year 120 million AD. So, human beings will have gone extinct well before then, unless we figure some stuff out real quick. So this is just not a serious concern. What is a serious concern, the way I think about this is, and I, again, some of this was research writing, some of this was also me just trying to apply what I know as a speechwriter, which is how do you take these ideas that might sound mystifying or might sound dense, and think about them in a way that helps people understand them. And I'll tell you the way that helped me understand it is that there's really two types of fraud we see in elections. One is fraudulently adding votes, and that's what I just described. So someone casting a vote as someone else, or we sometimes have seen mail-in ballot fraud, not in the way Trump talks about, but we've still seen it. Somebody casting votes they shouldn't. But the other is fraudulently subtracting votes. So taking eligible voters and purging them from the voter rolls, and therefore people can't vote even though they should be eligible. Subtraction is a much bigger threat to our democracy than addition. It's very hard to point to elections that have been swung, especially in recent decades, by fraudulently added votes. But fraudulently subtracted votes, that happens all the time, including, by the way, in Florida in the 2000 election, without a voter purge. And I was shocked. The 2000 election is the first I can remember, as the first that I really remember happening. And I remember the recount. I remember reading about all of that. And at no time did anyone ever point out, if there had not been this voter purge that kicked 12,000 eligible voters off the rolls, a clear disproportionate number of them African American, the odds that Bush would have won would have been absolutely tiny. No one mentioned it. They say this in the book. The only indication that something had gone very wrong was Al Gore's beard.
Well, and it looks like it happened in the last election in Georgia, in the governor's race.
Yeah. That was, well, actually, Fred, if you know, sorry, you got me worked up, but what's interesting about this is, so what happened in Florida was 12,000 voters. Between 2014 and 2016, we purged 16 million voters from the rolls, and a small c conservative estimate would say about 2 million or more of those voters were eligible to vote. So what we've seen is Florida got a lot of attention because it was a presidential election. It was the first case of this in recent memory. But the version that we're seeing now, this is a golden age of fraudulently subtracting votes. And in Georgia, they literally did everything. They did the purges that we talked, but they did stuff like, if you registered to vote and someone entered your information wrong, your registration didn't count. And so if you think about that, who does that really, think about the people who are entering the data, and then think about whose names are most likely to be entered incorrectly. So those are going to be people who don't have anglicized names, right? The John Smith, were having no problem getting their name entered. But if you had a more complicated name or a name that comes from another language, then you were much less likely to have your vote entered correctly. So in every single one of these cases, you have this combination of trying to keep people from voting and trying to make sure that the people you keep from voting are most likely to be non-white and most likely to vote for Democrats.
Well, since we're talking about voting, in the last presidential election, we had a candidate who got a lot of more votes than the current occupant of the White House. And yet, she still didn't win, which gets to this other thing called the Electoral College. You want to talk about that?
Sure. Fred, throughout the book, I tried very, very hard, even when talking about some of these issues we just discussed, where I clearly have an opinion. I tried hard to say, let's think about it, right? Let's weigh the arguments on both sides. For example, we just talked about people claim voter fraud. Let's see if they're right. The Electoral College is just dumb. It's really stupid. And it's the shortest chapter in the book because it's such a bad idea. So first of all, the Electoral College, just to be very clear about this, does not help small states. Because that's the reason I always learned that we had the Electoral College growing up was that it helps small states, not just so we're voting by state, not just by individual people. But if you look at it, Wyoming has 3 electors, California has 55 electors. So small states still get overlooked. Rural states, Arkansas, Vermont, that's a red rural state, a blue rural state, doesn't matter. Candidates aren't going there. The only thing that matters is whether or not you're a swing state. And that makes a huge difference. But the distribution of swing states is fairly random. So if you are, for example, if you're, Trump obviously is a perfect example. If you're Trump, then the Electoral College favored you in 2016. It will probably favor you in 2020. But in 2012, Obama could have lost the popular vote, and he still would have won the Electoral College. So it's completely random. And yet, and this was something I actually didn't include in the book, I've learned since, if you look at the difference in terms of which states matter, and this is good for Florida in fairness, but bad for the vast majority of the country, if you need a federal disaster declaration, that's much more likely to come if your state is a swing state, to give you just one example. And so what we're seeing is people who live in swing states matter in ways that people who don't live in swing states do not. And at this point, about 75% of the country doesn't live in swing states. So this is the same pattern, Fred, that we're seeing on everything. A smaller and smaller group of people matter a lot, and the majority of us don't matter very much at all.
So with that, I'm going to ask you to hold your book up again.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
Yeah, listen, in this time that we're in, I'm hoping everybody goes out and buys it, because never has this stuff been more important. One of the things you talk about in the book is the Skywalker window. You want to tell the readers a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what I call the Skywalker window, and I'm glad we're talking about it because I think it's a chance to talk about some of the solutions and some of the stuff in here that, I hope when you read the book, you will leave it feeling hopeful, even though we're talking about a lot of problems. So the way that change works in Washington today, and often at state government levels as well, is not this idea that we take sort of step by step by step and gradually make progress, as much as we would like that. That would be a better functioning system. Right now, the way I think that change works is sort of like the end of episode 4 of Star Wars, where you have Luke Skywalker, and he's in his X-Wing, and he's got that little opening in the Death Star, and there's just a moment where he can make his shot, and it closes really quickly. But if you make that shot, everything changes in an instant. And that's the Skywalker window. And that's why I wrote the book, because the point that I wanted to make is that all of these things that Mitch McConnell and his friends have done over the years to make our government more representative, we could undo them in a matter of months if we're deliberate about it, and we act in a way that is appropriate to the seriousness of the problem. I mean, I think of this book as a sort of guide to shattering Mitch McConnell's dreams within Mitch McConnell's lifetime. I think that is a very achievable goal. And I hope we achieve it then, because I really want him to know that it didn't work. And right now, unfortunately, he's got that smug look on his face all the time.
He does.
And smile off Mitch McConnell's face, and I think we can.
So with that, okay, because one of the tools that he has used to really have the influence he does is messing with the Senate filibuster. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that? Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, I will say the Senate is a mess for a variety of reasons, and they relate directly to gun violence and gun safety and gun violence prevention. So when Fred, you talk about the work that you've done and the work you've done sort of realizing that the money and then the politicians and learning how the system works so that you can change it. When I was in the White House, it was, I was there, I was on the campaign, and I came back not long after Newtown. And when President Obama was making the aggressive push for basic gun safety legislation, and at the time it was bipartisan gun safety legislation, and it could not get through the Senate. And the reason it couldn't get through the Senate is not even because most people, most states didn't want to do it. The important thing you need to understand about America today, I think, to understand American politics, is that states are more conservative than individual people. So Donald Trump won 30 states, and he lost the popular vote by about 2%. So states are 22% more conservative than the people are. And what that means is that senators are more conservative than the American people are, because senators are apportioned, they're handed out based on states rather than based on population like the House is. So in other words, states that are disproportionately white, disproportionately rural, disproportionately have gun owners, have lower rates of gun violence. Those states have a disproportionately large number of senators. So already they have an advantage. And then the filibuster gives them an even bigger advantage, because it says now you can't pass any law unless you get to 60 votes. And what I think is so important to understand here is that this is very new. And the filibuster is not set in stone. It's not in the Constitution. It was created by accident. It has been changed throughout every generation, more or less, of Americans have had this moment of saying, what do we do about the Senate filibuster? Because it's threatening to grind the country to a halt. And our new version was created by our good friend, Mitch McConnell, in response to Obama's election, where it now takes 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate. And fundamentally, that's going to make it hard to get a lot of popular bills through. I mean, today we had this great news from the Supreme Court protecting Daca, and protecting the rights of dreamers to stay in this country. But that bill would have become a law a long time ago because it's quite popular, right? Dreamers would have been protected by law if it wasn't for the Senate and the filibuster. So on issue after issue, starting with gun safety and gun violence prevention, the filibuster is keeping us from making the progress that America wants.
So I'm going to change gears. We have some questions on the board, so I'm going to just take a look at some of these. One of them is someone asking for you to talk about, is there any parallel between the time we're in now and the robber barons of the late 19th century?
That's a great question. I think there's, in economically, we are living in a new Gilded Age. That's certainly not a phrase I coined. Politically, we are also living in a moment where our campaign finance laws are being used to make sure that income inequality and economic inequality can translate directly to political inequality. So some good parallels from that time. The 1890s, interestingly, I don't know anything about the 1890s. Who knows about the 1890s? It turns out the 1890s actually have all sorts of parallels to today because on one hand, you had the rise of a very small, powerful group of very wealthy individuals. And on the other hand, you had all these people trying to stop them. And in the 1890s, the people trying to stop them mostly ended up failing. The campaign finance system we have today resembles to some extent the one that William McKinley had when he ended up raising more money than anyone before. And that was because his campaign chairman, Mark Hanna, went to corporations and wealthy people and he made a pitch, like an investment pitch. He said, give us 0.25% of your net worth. And then implicitly he was saying, and that way when William McKinley is president, he'll help you grow the other 99.75%. And that idea, even if it's not an explicit bribe of saying, here, give us some money now and we'll make sure to reward you later, we're seeing more and more. So one of the things, I talk about campaign finance in the book, and there's no question that we've moved so far backwards so quickly because of Citizens United and the other Supreme Court decisions like it, where we have moved closer to that robber baron era, not just economically, but politically as well.
All right. So voter turnout in the U.S. lower than other advanced democracies. What can we do about it?
Voter turnout in the United States is not just lower than in other advanced democracies. I mean, it's so much lower. That a lot of the stuff that I wrote about or I researched, I kind of knew going in the basic facts, and then I didn't know the numbers. So just to give you an example, and I'm trying to remember this right. So, the book is fact-checked. My brain is not fact-checked. But if we had New Zealand level participation, we would have added, I believe, 49 million voters to the rolls in 2016. 49 million. And New Zealand is barely in the top 10 in turnout. So that's not like a cherry-picked example. I think our voter turnout is better than Latvia, so that's good. But other than that, we lag behind almost everybody. And there's a few reasons for our low turnout. One of the reasons we don't have low turnout, or one of the things that is not a reason, is that people are just lazy or apathetic. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that. What there is a lot of evidence to suggest is that in the United States, voting is too hard for too many people. It's too difficult. So rather than asking, why don't people vote, we should be asking, what are the barriers to voting so that voting is an easy choice? The other reason, and I will say the first 3 chapters of the book, there's a lot to unpack there, they're all about who isn't voting and what is keeping people from voting. But the other reason people aren't voting, and this is important as well, is that people feel that their votes don't really matter. Votes don't technically count, but their votes don't matter. And so this goes back to the college point, is that if you have, for example, if you're living in a swing state, turnout tends to be 15% higher than in non-swing states. So that's a clear sign that when people feel like their vote matters, they go vote. And so a lot of these things that we think of as political reforms in a kind of vague sense, reforming gerrymandering, drawing districts, congressional districts, so that the winner is preordained, or ranked choice voting, which is slightly complicated, but the short version is it makes sure that you don't have to choose between wasting your vote and voting for your favorite candidate in a multi-candidate election. These reforms are not just voting reforms, they're turnout reforms. They're turnout boosting reforms. Because once people feel that their votes count, they're much more likely to go exercise their democratic rights and vote.
So with that, the next question is actually about technology. And just to sum it up, what are your thoughts on voting online?
So I think voting technology this will surprise no one who's voted recently, it's way behind. One of the things I did not fully appreciate. So think about, you go into your polling place, and if you're voting by machine rather than by paper, you have a touch screen, and your touch screen never looks like a tablet computer. I'm not saying it should be a tablet connected to the internet, but it doesn't look like a tablet. Why is that? Because when that machine was purchased, odds are very good that tablets did not exist. Most of our election technology and our voting machines come from about 2002. Now, the Trump administration, this is one of the few reasonably good things they've done. They have given some money to states to buy new voting machines. Not enough, but got to give them some credit somewhere, I guess. I'm like grasping at straws, but that's one of the straws, right? The problem is we're seeing a couple of different problems. One of them is technology is not a cure-all. So technology is good, but if you don't have poll workers who know how to use that technology, we saw this in Iowa with the Democratic caucuses where an app crashed on election night, and suddenly you had hours and hours and hours before results came in. You saw this in Georgia. I mean, there was such a mess last week in their primary, and partly that was because new voting machines went down. And also because poll workers often don't have the training to know what to do in the case of a plan B. So you don't just need technology, you need people who are trained to use the technology, and you need a backup plan for what happens when the technology doesn't work the way you wanted it to. Technology without a backup plan is worse than no new technology at all. When it comes to online voting, I think there's real potential for that. There have been some pilot programs that have started in local elections. I think the most recent was in New Jersey. I think we need to be really careful about it. Number one, for security reasons. Number two, you need Americans to understand how it works. So saying, don't worry, it's secure, the blockchain will take care of it. Like most Americans, I do not really know what the blockchain is. Even if you're right, you need to be able to reassure people that they can have faith in the system. And then number three, you want to make sure that you don't have a system where, for example, if you could vote online, you need to be able to do it from your phone fairly easily, because you don't want a system where it's very, very easy for the people who already have the most resources to vote as conveniently as possible, and then for everyone else not to. I will give you one example of a technology that could work, although they tried it in LA this year and it broke down. So again, you need the plan B. You go online, you fill out your ballot, and you get a QR code scanned to your phone. And then when you're in your polling place, you still have to go show up, but you check in, and then all you do is you scan your QR code and it repopulates your ballot, you confirm, and you're done. And what that does is it makes your interaction shorter, and you do that across enough people, and it brings down the line for everybody, not just the people using the voting technology, but everyone online waits less time.
I appreciate that answer, because I think it's a question that a lot of us have. Bringing us to the election, this question I think is also a fear and a question that a lot of people have, and it's about the transition. What if the current occupant of the White House loses and refuses to leave? What is the hope for a peaceful transition in that instance?
Man, well, thanks, Fred.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, here's what I'll say. I think, first of all, the fact that we're even talking about this says how far we have sunk as a country. And I just want to make clear, because sometimes we say, Trump is a reflection of our country. I don't think he is. So I'm like, not my fault. And along those lines, I do think that I worry that Trump So you can tell I'm worrying about this. It's not in the book because I don't.
We all are.
All right. But I did some very bad vamping, but I did think about it. Let me try to explain where my thoughts are. There's two dangers. One, which is smaller, but I think much more likely to happen. The presidential transition is really important. There's a lot of work that goes into going from one administration to the other. It's not just like unpacking your stuff and someone else moves in. And so there's all these procedures that are set up. George W. Bush, I was not a fan of George W. Bush, but he was terrific about when the Obama people came in, helping make sure that they were trained, that they understood how the system works. Everything from here's like where the printers are in the White House, but also just, so that you're handing someone like the baton and they can keep moving with it. And that's not just important for a president's political priorities, it's also important for national security. The Obama administration returned the favor with the Trump administration. And I was not in the Obama administration at the end, but I know from friends of mine who were there, the president, who obviously is not a huge fan of Donald Trump, but he made it very, very clear that your job, if you're still in the White House after the election, is to make their lives as easy as possible as they prepare to take power. I don't think that Trump will do that if Biden wins. And I think that's a really serious problem. I don't have a clear answer for how we deal with it, but we should be ready for that. We should assume that that's a baseline. Now, when we think about the even more dangerous scenario, which is Trump claims that the election was fraudulent and doesn't lead, I think what gives me some hope here is that I think what happened, I think it was 3 weeks ago, in D.C. was kind of a dry run for that. I mean, I live in D.C. It was really scary, right? It was just to step outside my house, which is a mile from the White House, maybe, and there were Blackhawks circling overhead. It was 5 days straight where you were hearing military helicopters. However, the way that the military and also some Republicans responded makes me think that it's not that the military is not chomping at the bit to be given an illegal order to preserve the president's power. I think it is unlikely to work. And it's scary that we have a president who might try, but in a strange sense, I think it is good that he has the evidence, because all Trump cares about is what he can get away with. I think it's good that he has the evidence from this month where he can say, if he's trying to make some decisions, this is going to end poorly for him. And I think that's the best hope that we have is him realizing that this probably will not end with him holding on to power.
I appreciate that. I think that's how I feel as well. I'm going to ask you two more questions. One on a topic that's important to me, and then one that's important to you. And this question is on the discussion you had on the conservatism of states. How do we make change to laws like gun reform laws? Is it in the messaging? Is it just going to be through successful elections? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would say both of the things you just described, Fred, are exactly right. We need to think about our messaging. And by the way, that's something we've done, I think, quite well. And by we, I mean you here. People have told their stories. They've shared, and including awful, wrenching, and painful stories like yours. And they've used those stories for good. We have, when I started in politics 10 years ago, back in the olden days, I worked in Ohio as a field organizer in the 2008 campaign. We were very careful about trying to be on the right side politically of the gun issue, and President Obama had his opinions, but we felt like the permission from voters was nowhere near where it is today. And now people understand the problem, and they understand the urgency of action, and they understand that organizations like the NRA are not their friend in a way they did not, even just a few years ago, even Fred, when you started your work. So we're doing that very well. Elections, you described the 2018 midterms, the fact that supporting gun control measures is now a political winner is a sea change in American politics. However, I think we are also going to have to do some other things because of the structural problems we've talked about. So number one, at some point we will have to get rid of the legislative filibuster. I went into writing the book thinking we should reform the filibuster. Now there's a 60-vote threshold for legislation. Maybe we take it down to 52 or 53. Ultimately, I feel, having talked to a lot of experts, that it is time to get rid of it. And we're running out of time here, so I'll let you, if you're interested in why, it's in the book. But I do think that it's time to end the filibuster. That chapter of the book also has a bunch of Polish vampires in it, by the way. So, lots of fun stuff, as well as some argumentation from myself.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
One other thing, sorry, Fred, about gun violence prevention. And this is how these things are connected. So next week, the House of Representatives is going to vote for the first time on a bill for DC statehood. And I care about that, obviously, because I live in DC. But more importantly, I care about that because you have hundreds of thousands of people, more people than live in Vermont or Wyoming, who don't have a voice in Congress, even though we pay lots of federal taxes. And DC is the bluest would-be state in the country. So it's a small way of evening out the disconnect between, or the imbalance of power, where the Senate naturally favors Republicans. Adding Puerto Rico as a state might have a similar effect. So we don't think of DC statehood as a gun violence issue, but DC statehood is absolutely a gun violence issue, because if you had 2 senators from DC, then you'd have 2 more votes in favor of doing something about gun violence. So these things are all connected in that way.
Thank you for that. Last question, and hold up the book again. And I do hope everybody, after listening to this, make sure they go out and they get their copy, because it's really been a great discussion. Before we finish, what was the audience you actually had in mind in writing your book? And maybe the key 1 or 2 takeaways that you would have for that audience.
Yeah. Well, I will answer your question, Fred, but first I want to ask you a question, because we talked about this before and I did bring it up. You just told me that you have your own book coming out this summer or early fall. So if you don't mind taking a couple of minutes, you've done a very heroic job here helping me plug my book. I want to just quickly talk about what do you have coming for us in a couple of months.
Thank you. My book is called Find the Helpers. I think everyone knows my story of what happened to my daughter on February 14th, 2018. She was murdered at school. In addition to that, 4 months prior, I lost my brother to cancer related to his service in 9/11. My brother ran the triage for the World Trade Center. He was a physician. And so following those 2 things, it would have been a really easy thing for me to fall apart. And instead I went on this mission to do something to change what happened to my family. And what I discovered in the process was healing. And I discovered that it was the people who were either a part of my life before this happened or who became a part of my life after this happened that literally carried me forward. And they were my helpers. Mr. Rogers, the TV character, has a very famous quote where he talks about his mother saying to him, whenever there's tragedy or terrible things happening, always look to the helpers, the policemen, the firemen, the doctors, your neighbor, because as long as there are helpers, you can have hope. And for me, my helpers were my lifeline. And so I wrote this book hoping that for anyone going through tough times, difficult times, or even amazing times and not sure what to do with it, always remember those around you and your helpers and make them a part of it. They will have your back and they will carry you. And that's the book. And I'm really excited to get it out. One of the key helpers who I do get a chance to talk about in this book is our next president, Joe Biden, who reached out to me very early on and who had a conversation with me on grief unlike anyone else, and what to expect and how to get through it and to go forward, and who then continued to stay in touch with me to make sure my wife, my son, and I were doing okay. He was a helper to me, but we see it now going through this coronavirus pandemic. He can be a helper to this country. So I'm excited to get this out. I'm excited to talk about those things. I appreciate you asking about it.
Yeah, and I hope I will be leading the charge here, and I will happily order your book from Books and Books, and I hope plenty of people watching do the same. And actually, Fred, conveniently, I guess, the way you just talked about your upcoming book, it leads me into my answer to your question about who did I write this for and what do I want people to take away. So I wrote this for people who want to be helpers. And I don't mean that in the sense of professionally all the time. I wrote my first book about this idea that public service does not need to be a full-time job, but that public service needs to be everyone's part-time job. And to me, a book like this, which, this book is much more research heavy, full of stories. I still try to keep it fun, but the idea is that you don't know how much work went into it when you read it. And I wrote it for people who want to be serving somehow in this moment, who say, this book is what I would not have done if someone other than Trump had become president. But I felt like with Donald Trump as president, I needed to understand how we got here and how we can move forward to a better place together. And so there's so many people, I think, who are in the same boat, who say, I want to do something different. I want to be part of fixing this before it's too late. And I don't want to look back 5 years from now or 10 years from now, or when I'm talking to my children or my grandchildren and say, oh, I'm one of the people who didn't do something. But at the same time, it's so mystifying and so bewildering because we have this complicated system and because Mitch McConnell has found ways to seize power that are not obvious. So that combination of problems is why I wrote the book. If you feel like you want to know what's going on so that you can help fix it, that's a broad category, I hope, both as an author, but more importantly as an American. And that's why I wrote it. And also, if you like tales about, adult men trying to crash fraternity parties, you're also right in the core demo for this book. But so I hopefully the response so far has been great, and I'm hoping that it will have something useful to contribute at a time when I think that really matters. So let me just say one more time, Fred, thank you again for doing this. This is a real pleasure.
Thank you, David. And I wish you the best of luck with your book. And more importantly, I really do hope people buy it and read it, because we've got to get this right. And our democracy is worth the effort and worth the fight. And I appreciate that you took the time to write about it the way that you did. So thank you.
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. So thank you.
Hi again. Thank you, David and Fred, for being with us tonight. Thank you for your exciting back and forth and for your sincerity. I'll be mulling over that note on being a helper and getting this thing right for a good bit now as well. For everyone watching, thank you all for joining us. When I say so myself, that was intelligent, authentic, and riveting. Now,
thanks,
on
guys.
the future, we have many more virtual events coming up this month, so please follow us on social media and sign up for our email blast so you don't miss out. Remember, you can order David's book, Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think, from Books and Books Now. Good night, everyone. Have a great evening and stay safe. Until we meet again.
Good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.